All right, hi everybody.
Hi.
How y'all doing this morning?
Good.
Good. All right, I'll let a couple people finish up conversations. Just be nice, be very SEL-y of me. Be very patient. It's a new adjective I'm trying out, SEL-y. All right. All right, hi everybody. My name is Nick Yoder. I am with the American Institutes for Research. I am a senior consultant and researcher at AIR, and I am really excited to talk with you all this morning about District 2 state connections. I am very honored and privileged to have worked with many of these states, along with Linda, supporting and developing their social emotional learning guidance, documents, and processes, and beginning to work with them in state district collaborative efforts. And a lot of this work has been through both the American Institutes for Research work, as well as through federal centers, federally funded technical assistance centers hosted by the American Institutes for Research, such as the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders, the Great Lakes Comprehensive Center, and the Midwest Comprehensive Center, has afforded me the opportunity and staff to do a lot of this work. So I'm going to kick off where Linda left off in thinking about the developmental progressions. And when I was asked to talk about this, I was really in the thinking about, we should talk about these district partnerships that are really collaborating to move this work forward. But I feel like we would be remiss if we don't talk about the story of how states in various capacities have worked with stakeholders throughout the entire process, because I think that's really key to the work that they've done, is really how they have engaged with them. And they've engaged in stakeholders in multiple different ways throughout the process, from obtaining input through the launch phase, through actually engaging stakeholders in the work to do the work in their intermediate phase, and then really thinking about these pilots and collaboratives in this advanced phase. So how are they getting their work out there? And so what I'm going to do in the next 15 or so minutes is really talk through each of these three phases and give you explicit examples of how states have done this. So my goal is really to give you snapshots, little teasers, if you will, of the various work that we've done at state education agencies and working with their stakeholders. And if I've missed a state or anything like that, there's multiple state examples. I chose one because I have 15 minutes to do this. So we're going to start off with the initiating, the launch phase, right, and obtaining input from stakeholders. And generally, there's three ways that I've seen states do this. One, prior to starting the work. So the very beginning of the phases, check-ins, are they moving in the right direction, and throughout the process, which is through like a co-design process. So I'm going to start with the prior to starting the work. So actually, I'm going to see if this is a geography lesson, see if you guys can guess the states. Just kidding. I would if we had more time. That is Ohio. So Ohio has done a nice job prior to starting the work of engaging stakeholders. They did this through a survey. So at the very beginning, when they were starting their efforts, they applied for the CSI, and they were like, but we really don't know where to actually begin, even though we have this plan. We want to make sure that our stakeholders are on board. So they sent out a survey to all their stakeholders throughout the state, so administrators, superintendents, counselors, social workers, and the like. And they received about 8,000 responses, which wasn't a lot for their state. It was about 2 to 3%, but it was representative of the geography of the state, which is what they were really worried about, because there are differences within the state of Ohio based on their support of SEL. And overwhelmingly, they found support for social and emotional learning, wanting to develop social and emotional learning standards and associated guidelines. So that's where they started. They're like, oh, this is what they want. Told you, quick snippets, teasers. Next state, Michigan, check-ins. So one of the really great things that I've been working with Michigan for about 4 years now in their social and emotional learning efforts. And one of the very first things they did was develop their birth to grade 12 developmental benchmarks around social and emotional learning. The second step then was to develop an implementation guide about what they wanted to do. So I had been working with Pat on an implementation guide in Tennessee, and I was like, oh, this is perfect. We can leverage what Pat was doing and just kind of modify it a little bit and place it in Michigan. So that's what we did, and we wanted to get input from stakeholders. So my client or colleague, Lauren Kazee in Michigan, went out to districts and was like, look at this great resource we developed. They're like, it's great, but And what was interesting about it, it wasn't because it was bad. No offense to Pat. Because it's great, because it was received well with Pat in Tennessee. But the reason why it didn't work in Michigan is because it didn't connect with initiative that they were already working on. Right? Like in Pat's case, it was really focused on their team evaluation system, whereas in Michigan, they really wanted to connect it to their school improvement plan. So we took a step back. We basically revised the entire document to really create something. And so they had a check-in to make sure they were moving in the right direction. And then throughout the process, or a co-design process. And John, I know, will probably talk about this a little bit, and Jordan can talk about this, but in their stakeholder group, they're being very purposeful about how to engage stakeholders throughout the entire process. So they have an advisory group that's been together for a little over a year now, and that represent multiple stakeholders across the state in different different tribal nations, different LEAs, associations, and whatnot. And what they really wanted to do is they didn't want to be the representative for an entire group. So they are trying to find design principles of how to actually take the learning and the work that they're doing in the subgroups and their groups at the state level to go back to the community to get their involvement about the design of their resources and guidance documents that they're currently developing in the state. So they're trying to really embed this throughout the entire process. All right, engaging stakeholders, intermediate phase. So there's 3 ways that I've seen states do this. You've already started hearing a few different ways that folks have done this up here in the panel before us: advisor committees, writing groups, short-term consultancies. So I'm not going to go too much into this because Kay just talked about Iowa and her advisory committee, but that's one of the ways of having an overarching advisory committee to help oversee various initiatives that are happening at the state. How are we organizing everything that we want to see at a state level, and how are we supporting that? Again, made up of multiple different efforts. Then writing groups is kind of the second way that we've seen engage stakeholders in the work. And Heather Hirsch, who's right over there at the Minnesota Department of Education, has done this extraordinarily well. It started off with one big writing group to develop their SEL standard or benchmarks and learning goals. Sorry if I mess up the terms that you use at the states. You all use different ones. And but what she did, from that process, they developed their standard or their learning goals and then wanted to develop a series of guidance documents. And so they wanted to develop an assessment guidance, an implementation guidance, a professional development guidance, a special education guidance, a cultural competence guidance document, and a crosswalk. Did I miss anything? Good, perfect. And so that's a lot to do when it was just Heather and a few small staff. So what she was very smart to doing was saying, hey, the previous writing group for the SEL indicators, why don't you help me develop these guidance documents? So she tasked people to lead these working groups to actually go out and do the work of the working groups. And they'd come back to Heather, they'd come back to me, get some feedback on it, and then they'd continue working on it. And this is how she was able to develop all those documents that are now online within about a year process, because she really engaged her stakeholders to develop the writing group and the work that was happening within the state. The other really great example, as I sort of started talking about, is Michigan. So Lauren did a really nice job of really developing a network. So not only to get feedback on the process, but sort of begin to disseminate what was the learning that was happening within the field. So she was able to, one of the things that she also did is she asked a small group of educators to do a crosswalk between their social and emotional learning indicators and their academic standards. So she found a cohort of about 20 or so teachers, brought them in for a day-long meeting, and they sat and did a crosswalk between their social and emotional learning competencies and their learning goals. So just a really quick engagement with stakeholders to get their feedback. And now these stakeholders are really invested and become pioneers for the work and are now spreading it within their districts, within their schools. And then when she wants additional guidance, so for example, we're developing online modules in the state of Michigan, she contacted many of them to provide case studies and small snippets to include within the online learning modules. And so she really has this now large network that she's been able to involve within the process, within these short-term consultancies, to actually do some of the work with them. Finally, creating pilots or collaboratives, right? So this is in the advanced stage, and there's 4 different ways that I've seen states really start and take hold of this: professional learning, translating guidance, micro-credentials, and collaboratives and communities of practice. Professional learning. So I've been working with Pat for the last about 4 years now in developing online professional learning for their stakeholders, for their educators. And one of the reasons, so they're doing an intro to SEL online learning module, and then they were developing a series of 10 online modules for practices that support social, emotional, academic development, or personal development in Tennessee's case, which she'll explain, I'm sure, in a minute. And what we wanted to do with these is to be able to have an avenue both for teachers who are in rural parts of the state who might not have access to curriculum or access to supports to be able to engage in an online learning platform, but we also developed them in a way that had a facilitator guide where a school or a district could take hold of these and actually implement them within their actual building. So it gives a script, it gives a PowerPoint, it gives activities that they can do, but it gives a nice strategy both for in-person folks, so those early adopters, but also those folks who kind of want to take it and move the work forward. And this is really helping her build her capacity because she can't go out and do hundreds of trainings on social and emotional learning, but really allowing schools then to be able to take hold and take root of the professional learning. Translating guidance. So as I just mentioned, Heather has done a really nice job of developing a series of guidance documents. But then what does that look like in practice, right? Like as Linda mentioned, this is kind of the question that we're beginning to answer is what does this stuff look like? And so she just started a collaborative with some rural districts in the northern part of the state to focus on school climate improvement. And as part of their school climate improvement, they can either select social emotional learning or restorative practices to focus on. And those that focus on social emotional learning, we're going to think about how can we translate the guidance documents that were developed at the state level into workable, usable tools at the district level. And so really trying to work with them in a very supportive manner in order to move this work forward, which is beginning. She just had her first meeting, and then we're going out there to do the SEL work next month. So it's going to be super exciting to really begin and see what this work takes hold. Another way that folks are doing this are through micro-credentials. So if you're not familiar, micro-credentials are these certificates that educators can receive by doing a competency-based assessment. And so one of the things, so I worked with Washington to develop a series of online modules, and their professional education standards boards wanted to take these online modules and see if we can develop a micro-credential around it. And so they developed, in collaboration with AIR and Bloomboard, a micro-credential on introduction to social emotional learning through a culturally responsive lens. And so right now we are in the pilot phase of developing this micro-credential. About 300 teachers are currently engaged within the process along 11 collaboratives within the state. It's a very beginning process, so it's really exciting to see like how this platform is really going to take off and move forward in terms of how we can think about competency-based assessments and micro-credentialing processes. The final thing that I want to talk about is the collaboratives or communities of practice. Rhode Island has done a very good job for a number of years really developing and creating a community of practice. And this has been very online, virtual, as well as in-person meetings where they've had folks come together and really begin to just share. And it's been a very organic process within the state. It's been a very innovative way and approach to really get folks to see how the work is connecting within the state and across the state to support kids' social and emotional development. So there's a few key things that I think is really important to think through when we're summarizing stakeholder engagement throughout the entire process. One, engaging throughout the process is critical, right? And states have been very purposeful in the way that they've engaged their stakeholders based on needs, based on time, based on resources. It's been very critical about how they've actually engaged folks within the work. And throughout this process, they've constantly gone back to their stakeholders and created tools and resources that engaged and supported SEL integration with other important efforts. So it's very rare that a state has developed something that isn't connected with something else that they're already doing. And really trying to leverage what folks are really doing in this state has been critical. But it doesn't mean states aren't already leveraging each other's work, right? As I mentioned before, Michigan and Tennessee, they partnered. Even though it wasn't a one-to-one fit, there was a lot of leverage in terms of the content that was included in the Michigan guidance document that was in the Tennessee guidance document. It just needed to be reformatted to fit the needs of Michigan educators. Lots of states are now using the Washington online modules within their states to develop online learning modules. So a lot of states are using these evidence-based tools and resources that already exist for the field and with the field together. And finally, bringing together these district-to-state partnerships is super exciting. I'm really excited to be engaged within this work with multiple states to really see how we can move the work forward and how these tools and resources really translate, and to be able to hear from our partners and other panelists about how they have done this work. And that is what I got. Thanks so much. Do I turn this off? Sorry. I don't know how. No. I think I got it.
Okay, are we ready? Good morning. I'm Chris Amundsen, the President and CEO of the National Association of State Boards of Education, and I am enormously flattered to have been asked to be here to moderate this morning panel. And guys, all I can say is, having heard the first one, we better up our game because they were really good. Our job here is really to share the idea that there are, in fact, best practices that we can all learn from. And our job on this panel is in part to share what some of those things are. I will ask each panelist to introduce him or herself and then talk with you very briefly about one big lesson that they are learning or have learned in their work. And then I'll share some of what we've been learning by looking at state boards. I will say this, that if I could put in an overarching framing principle, we want this to be a reform that sticks. And if it's sticky, that means it's either got to be in the code book or it's got to be in state board policy. It is not enough to have committed principals and teachers, because as the previous panel mentioned, principals move on. And so you want to have something sticky. Now, I've done a little research, and fortunately I can say this as a previous for 10 years state legislator. Mostly state legislatures have been very slow in working on social and emotional learning, or if they've done things, a lot of bad stuff has been killed. Tennessee springs instantly to mind. But what I would say is that the second place that you can have sticky policy is by working through your State Board of Education. And so I was glad to hear Kelly's discussion about the process that they used in New Jersey to make sure, and I think that is true even if you are a very strong local control state. Having some kind of overarching state policy is really useful. But let's hear from the people who are really the experts here, and I'm going to start with Pat Connor from Tennessee.
Thank you. Takeaways. Implementing social and personal competencies in Tennessee was a challenge, but we knew it was important. What we do know from our work is, just as you were alluding to, it has to be embedded and aligned with everything you're doing at the state level. It is not a standalone. That's the biggest takeaway that I know everyone here knows. It needs to be embedded in all our work, from instruction, as Nick talked about our online modules. Our online modules are on his work around the 10 teaching practices that promote social and emotional learning. Our online modules are very near completion for all 11, and we are using those as a micro-credential pilot in our state. It begins this month with our first 2 modules. So we're embedding it in our instruction. We're also embedding it in all our work with MTSS. Our department has recently realigned my job responsibilities and renamed. You get a new title every couple of months, but my commissioner had extreme forethought to realign our work streams. And with the Office of Student Support, through our multi-tiered system of support, take all of our work we're doing with RTI2, with PBIS, with social and personal competencies, with trauma, with school-based mental health services, and we're all under that one umbrella. Social and personal competencies in our state is a Tier 1 bucket. So it's very important that we align all of that work together. And as Nick talked about, one of the first things that I did was to align that with our teacher effectiveness. If you can show teachers, I will get a better score on my evaluation by embedding and integrating social and personal competencies in my everyday instruction, then I'm all for it. So the other thing that I want, of course, we have a lot of resources, and if you go to the, you have to be like Indiana Jones to find our website sometimes. But if you go to the Tennessee Department of Education, in that search engine box, you can put social and personal competencies, and you will see our page pop up. On our page are our resource guides with our standards, and we did our toolkit first to implement and align that with the team rubric, is what we call our team evaluation process. Then came our resource guide, and I'm an old educator. I've been in this, I'm going on 34 years, and I am so accustomed to doing nothing with nothing. Something with nothing, excuse me. Yeah, nothing with nothing, that's me. So something with nothing. So our resource guide has all the core competencies. It has the dimensions. It has the developmental indicators. It's by grade band. But then we put strategies in there. And so we are hoping that educators, and we have done, I can't even tell you how many thousands of educators and administrators that we've brought this work to. Because we know we need to engage all stakeholders. But our last thing that we've done is our social and personal competency collaborative, and Nick joined me this summer. We have taken this down by invitation, next year expand it, to work with districts on how they can take this work and implement it into their school improvement plans. At the district level, which is that you talk about integrating and embedding, you get it in a school improvement plan, they got to do it. So that's what we're doing in Tennessee.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And you saw up there in Nick's presentation, we kept seeing that map of Washington State. So it's not a surprise, perhaps, that we have two different people from two different districts in Washington. And first, we have Vicki Blakeney from Renton School District.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. Great. So I'm actually going to kind of frame my thinking around, as a district employee who has been tasked in two different districts to do social emotional learning, what did the states do for me? So I'm just going to tell you honestly, like, what I used from the states, how they helped me, what I did as a district employee. So the first state that I did this work in was in Alaska, because I worked for the Anchorage School District. And so what the state did for me there, and it's very self-serving, but the first thing they did for me was funded my position. And and so they gave a grant to the Anchorage School District through the Alaska Association of School Boards for me to have a job. And I was specifically put into the curriculum department in the Anchorage School District as the SEL curriculum coordinator. And then they met with me quarterly and were thought partners. So we would meet every few months and we'd say, okay, what are we doing now? Where is this going? And they, at that point, we were patterning ourselves after the Illinois standards, where she went, and trying to decide what Anchorage standards would look like. And we designed some standards, and so we would bring, the state would come and we'd think together around those. The other thing that I feel like the state did for me on that was that they encouraged and congratulated the leadership above me. Like, fine to say we're doing a good job, but way better for my superintendent to hear, oh, we love what you guys are trying to do there. Because then, as they're hearing congratulations for what you're doing, they're not going to get rid of it, right? And so then when the funding went away after a few years, we were able to survive not having that funding, because at this point they had talked to the school board about how great this was, that the school board was taking it intentionally, etc. So I feel like if we could figure out a way to congratulate those people who are doing the work, that was a big part for me. Also, by the way, speaking of funding, and I don't know that you have any power in this, but if we could forward fund and we could adequately fund, especially our teachers, that sure makes a difference. Because if our teachers in the buildings, first of all, have some, sense of self-respect and et cetera, and wellness and well-being, then it's going to be a lot easier for them to implement social emotional learning, right? And then on the other side of that, when they put somebody like me at the district, it can limit some of that us versus them. right? So I'm in there trying to implement social emotional learning and support them, and I don't want to just be seen as one of those administrators who gets too much money when they're in the classroom working their tails off, and why would we listen to them, right? So if they feel respected, forward funded, et cetera, it makes it a little easier for me to do my work. Just saying. So, go push that with whoever you can push that with for me. Oh, I forgot to push play. I got 5 minutes still. Yay! Okay, I'll go faster, I promise. The other thing that they did for us there is they developed a school climate survey. So there is an Anchorage or Alaska school climate survey with AIR's help. And the entire state did it, so that, and that part of congratulating, not only did we therefore see our state academic scores, we published our school climate scores alongside of those, and those were part of our school report card, so that principals could feel like, oh, look at that, I'm awarded because I have this really positive school climate, etc. So those are some of the things that Alaska did, but that was before the collaborating states. We joined the collaborating district initiative a couple years in, et cetera. So now I'm in Washington, who is a part of the collaborating states initiative. I was in Nevada, but all I can tell you about my Nevada work is that what I love about what Nevada has done is they brought somebody in to lead the work that's outside of the school system. She knows education, but she is from the community, so she can push the system because she understands how the system works. So if you really want to talk to somebody about the amazing work, talk to Christy in the back over there because she really knows what the communities want from education because she did the work as a community member. And I love to listen to what she thinks of. So in Washington, what am I using as a result of the work that you're doing? I use the SEL standards that Washington has adopted. They give me a lot of sort of cachet. They also give me, when we're talking about programs, the Renton School District has a handful of different, like they have adopted Second Step. They've adopted something that they call sound discipline. Some of them are PBIS schools, et cetera. And if I'm going to do anything to coordinate it, I need something that's coordinating, right? So I use the SEL standards. What I appreciate about the work that they're doing with the Washington SEL standards is that they are carefully vetting them through communities because we have a lot of diversity. And I want to know that if I'm bringing forward these standards, that somebody has at least thought through the various cultures that I'm trying to serve with the standards. I also am back to them doing some sort of realistic expectation on us. If you're going to say we have to do the next generation of science standards and we have to do the next whatever, if you can show me that you've thought through, I'm asking for this many hours of literature and this many hours of science and this many hours of everything else, you've got to still leave space because I can't do it if you haven't given me space. And then finally, if the funding is beautiful. I love that we have funding for this. I love that ESSA funding is showing up, and they're making it easy for me to get the ESSA funding, and so I can do this work. I would like it someday if there's a way to do funding that doesn't have, this is going to sound opposite of the equity conversation, and I don't mean that at all, but most funding that I can get is for the schools that show really deep need. But I also have schools that are going, but we're ready. Can somebody help us? And it's hard for me to find the right fit for that. So those are some of my thoughts.
Thanks very much. Finally, from sort of the other side of the state is John Winkle, who is in the Republic School District.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've got to tell you I'm pretty intimidated, so bear with me. So my name is John Winkle, and I am the superintendent of 2 school districts. If you had looked at the arrow that was pointing at Washington State, you'd be pointing directly at our school districts. And when people say, well, where is that? I say we're about 150 miles north and 150 miles and 100 years north of Spokane. My county has 7,000 people in it, and we don't have a traffic light in the county of any sort. So we are a remote and rural school district. The good thing is my cell phone does not work when I get home. But I do put my home phone number on every piece of correspondence. My school districts that I represent, one is 160 students and one is 300 students. But the reason that I've been involved in the state work, and I've been at the state, I've been working with the state for the 3 years that the legislature authorized funding, first to do indicators around social emotional learning, the second to do the modules, which Nick did a fantastic job guiding us through, and thirdly, the current work that Jordan and I are doing with a group of people to develop something we've yet to name, but we started with indicators. And what they will eventually be called, I'm not sure. What I'd like to talk to you, though, a little bit about is my experience as a practitioner. As a superintendent in a small school district, I not only get to manage the policy, I get to manage the money. So I can dedicate the resources to this, and I can say that this is going to be an emphasis in our district. And in partnership with the Rural Alliance for Student Success, which is 84 rural districts representing 46,000 students, we implemented a 10-district pilot program. This program was funded through the College Spark Foundation, and initially we had about 35 districts ask to be part of this, and we could only take 10. By the second year of the program, we were down to 5 school districts. 2 of those school districts were mine. And the reason we were down to these districts is because the definition of what social emotional learning is not well understood. That's my opinion. The other thing is that leadership changed. Of those 10 districts, 5 of them had new superintendents within 2 years. The other thing that occurred in that was that the program, which is it's a program that's very successful in Renton, we used the same provider, was not customized for the rural district. And so we were faced with a situation where we have a hunger, we have an enormous need, and yet we lack the resources in these rural districts to fully engage in the work necessary to be successful. And I don't know how we're going to address that. We're currently working very, very hard to take the frameworks, because the work is there. Everything has been done to allow us success. But until we can put the other pieces around that I believe are absolutely essential to success, which are mental health support, engaging our families through doing parenting classes, making sure that our culture, which is a culture of rub some dirt on it, get up and you'll be fine, accepts that we need to have a more kind and compassionate system, we're going to have some major barriers. The other thing that I absolutely believe is that this work has to have champions. And the champions have to be the people who will stand toe-to-toe with the administrators in the district and take those arrows that every principal's got in their back. When the teacher stands up and says, I'm not doing that, or when someone else says, I'm not, this is not the way we do things here. And it's incredibly ironic that I have to bully people into being nice to each other. But I'm willing to do that if it's what's best for kids. So I think this is such important work. What we don't understand about Washington State, how many students are in your school district?
15,000.
There are 15,000 students in Vicky's school district. That's more than twice the number of people who live in my county. There are 295 school districts in Washington State. The vast majority of those school districts are under 1,500 students and face the same resource challenges that I face. And so as we move forward with this work, we have to figure out how to make this applicable and customizable to every community. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Before we turn to questions, and we are really committed to leaving a lot of time for interaction between the panel and the audience, I thought I would share with you a couple of the lessons we've learned from looking at state board agendas. One of the things we do is to look at every State Board of Education agenda every month. And you can find out then that information on our website in a database called State Board Insights. What we've found is that since the beginning of 2017, about 1 in 3 boards has taken up the issue of social and emotional learning. And I really drew 2 lessons that I think are worth sharing today. The first is that state boards are trying hard to give deference to local districts and to allowing local districts to implement programs in the way they best see fit. And I think, John, it's probably clear from what you said that there's going to have to be an even greater emphasis on how you work with small and rural districts. But at least state boards are aware of that. The second thing that I thought was fascinating is that in many cases when the issue comes up, it's raised by the student member, by a student advisory committee, by some sort of student engagement process that the board has engaged in. And so I just offer that to you as a thing you should know about if you are now at the beginning stage of where Kelly was and you're trying to think about bringing things before your state board. Involving students is going to be key. And I know Kay talked about that some when she was talking about what was going on in Iowa. So our goal now is to engage with all of you in conversations about what are the best practices, what should we be sharing. And I'm going to start by asking this group one question, and then please get your thinking caps on because we're going to leave lots of time. But that is, what should we be doing now to make sure that social and emotional learning is not just this year's hot topic to be replaced next year by, I don't know, hands-on science, I mean, fill in the blank, right? And so I would love to ask all of you, because you've been doing this work in states and in districts, what are the things that are going to be most useful to making this part of something that will last and not be a one-year flash in the pan? Pat, I don't know if you want to start?
Yeah. So I think the key to that is to make sure that it's embedded in just the way teachers do business every day. Mm-hmm. It cannot be standalone. It's how teachers do their instruction. It's how they operate their classrooms. It's in your school climate. It's just in the general operational, everyday operational piece for all schools. And that's the way we're approaching it through the Department of Education. We are also approaching it through our trauma work. It's good business every day for all students. And I think that's the key. It's not a standalone. It's not a program that you buy. It's your, just again, the way you operate as a teacher. And that's why somebody in the first panel said this, and I think this is extremely important. I would like to see a lot of this work at the national level be about teacher prep. It has to be an integral part of teacher prep in universities, not only social and emotional learning, but all the research about trauma and children, how it affects brain development, all that good stuff. So we have got, because we're getting teachers in Tennessee, that the overwhelming response, 73% of them told us in our teacher survey, we do not know how to handle these issues because we were never taught in our teacher prep classes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anybody else have a thought?
I have a couple thoughts. One is I think that there has to be a really careful balance, and that's why I like what Nick was saying about how Washington brings in people to wrestle around the ideas, and therefore he has champions. So I want, as much as I can, to have the state standards and the indicators, but I also like the idea of my people now coming in to wrestle around that, and what does that mean to us, and what are our signature practices going to be, et cetera, because then they have their own level of buy-in. So there has to be a balance so that there's not some sort of top-down, okay, now you do this, because that won't work for us. But when The other thing is, for me, and this is just me speaking, so you can take it with whatever you want, but the struggle for me will be if once we get really deeply embedded Tier 1 social emotional learning, the Tier 2 and Tier 3 is challenging. And that if we can't figure out what Tier 2 and Tier 3 are going to be for us, then I feel like it's going to be harder for us to say, oh yeah, that works. And so if we could figure out from a state level a little bit more with that Tier 2 and Tier 3, and how do we fund that and how do we support that, because obviously that takes a little different level of intensity, I think that would help with some of that sustainability.
That's really useful. John?
So I agree with everything that's been said. The other aspects of that, right now Title IV funding in Washington, which is a new, relatively new type of funding, is being largely dedicated to this work. I believe that needs to be codified in some way, that's an emphasis. I also believe there needs to be, within the state of Washington, there needs to be a clear mandate from our Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction that our Learning Assistance Program, or LAP funding, can be used for this work. Most districts are doing that anyway, although quite obliquely. And I think those two things first will set the precedent. The second thing, which I don't think can be overemphasized, this work is not a silver bullet to cure an issue with students who are not being successful. This work will raise the bar for all children and all staff, and we have to emphasize that this is a community effort as well. So that those messages have to get out there.
I would offer two thoughts on funding. One is that it is not possible for states to forward fund. Usually it's in your constitution. So, but what you can do is exactly some of the work that Vicki was talking about, where you lay out at least, this is what phase 2 is going to look like, this is what Tier 2 is going to look like, this is what Tier 3 is going to look like, so people can at least see that coming. And then the second thing is to go back to Nick's very first point about engaging stakeholders, because it is much, much harder, speaking as a former elected official, to get rid of something in the state budget that has 27 people showing up in your hearing saying, let me tell you how this has changed my child's life, than it is, if you have one lone central office administrator who says, oh no, trust me, this is really good work. So making stakeholder engagement not just a thing you did at the beginning, but as Nick said, embedding it throughout the process is not only important in terms of the quality of the product, but frankly also the survival of the program. So those are my two thoughts as somebody who has raised my hand on more budgets than I really care to think about. I spent billions of dollars of somebody's money over the course of my career as a local school board member and then as a state legislator. We would like now to open this up to all of you. Yeah, and wait for the mic, I think, which is coming right here. Yes, right.
I'm Mike McGee from Chiefs for Change. A question about two trends that we're seeing across our membership. We have leaders who collectively serve about 7.5 million kids around the country. One is, John mentioned Title IV, I think largely because of the national conversation we're having about gun violence. We're seeing within our membership and the legislatures that they work with new conversations about increased funding for behavioral and mental health services, aligning state funding to what's happening with Title IV. And two, we're about to have roughly 24 new governors emerge in November, and everything we hear is that their top priority is going to be around workforce development. And so thinking about all of the competencies and skills that we talk about in this room and their relevance to employers and workforce development, are those conversations that you're trying to align to the SEL conversation in your states and communities, and are you finding allies among the agencies that work on mental and behavioral health, workforce development, that you can kind of bring to bear on support for your work?
Let me just tell you if you look at our resource guide in Tennessee, that is our hook. It is our social and personal competencies are tied to college and career ready students and to workforce development. We have a very, very strong partnership with the economic development folks in Tennessee. That is a high priority for our commissioner, a high priority for education, and we work very closely with our CTE folks. But that is our hook for that. And as far as mental health resources are concerned, I very much empathize with John. Tennessee is primarily a rural state. Lack of mental health resources is astounding. If I could tell Congress anything, we've got to fund these mental health agencies to provide this work in our rural districts. We are, telehealth is well and good, but I'm an old counselor person. I'd like to have a one-on-one relationship in person with someone. So those mental health resources, and we have utilized a lot of Title IV funding, our districts have, for that, and our governor, Bill Haslam, just gave the state of Tennessee $35 million from his budget to fund school safety. A large percentage of that went to fund social workers and mental health resources. But the gap between that and providing services in schools, it's not a gap, it's a divide. We have got to address that.
So the workforce development rules that were recently implemented in Washington State make it actually much more difficult for us to access funding and resources for our students in the rural communities. We're working on how we might do something collaboratively amongst using our Rural Alliance or some other mechanism to increase the availability of funds. My county is a resource extraction county, cattle, timber, and gold. Gold mine just closed. There are no working timber mills. So we're in a world of hurt in that community. And when you're in that situation, we're 50 miles to the nearest mental health facility, and that is over a mountain pass that is treacherous at best. And so those aspects of just community service need to be addressed, and I don't know the solution. It's going to be a real challenge.
I would say that the most powerful advocates for community mental health that I ever heard as a state legislator were sheriff's deputies who came in their uniforms and said, we are right now the mental health institution of last resort in this community, and we are really expensive, and we do it very badly. And please don't give us any more money to do that. Please give somebody else money who knows what they're doing. And I think it is critically important to forge partnerships with law enforcement at the local level because they get it. I think they understand that you can't have public safety if you don't have public mental health. And the second thing is, we say to governors all the time, you're not going to be a workforce governor if you're not an education governor first. So, but great question. Next question.
Hi, I'm Jim Vetter from the Social Emotional Learning Alliance for Massachusetts and the Social Emotional Learning Alliance for the United States. That I'm really excited to hear what's been happening, what you're talking about, a kind of theme that I was hearing here around, John was talking about, you have to have champions. Right? As Vicki was talking about, the importance of having the kind of the guidance that comes from the state that allow, to sort of give the ammunition, if it were, and that's a bad term, isn't it? For the local communities that come from these kind of the national documents that are coming out, the kind of support from CASEL, another person talked about how that's helpful. But we're hearing about the importance of also having those kind of grassroots folks who are able to, as Kristen was talking about, come to the hearing and say, you're thinking about this in the state budget. Well, it's not just this one important person who's coming from a state agency. We've got 28 people from communities around the state who are testifying about why this is important. And I'm wondering, and Nick was talking about that too, with the kind of the stakeholder engagement, developing those kind of champions. I'm wondering if folks have thoughts about how we can kind of blow on those sparks, kind of build that flame so that we really do have champions throughout all of our communities, which is one of the ways we make sure that if a superintendent leaves, if the people on the school board who are interviewing the new superintendent all have this as a key value, they will hire a new superintendent who also supports that. That how do we grow those champions?
And maybe the Washington people could start, because I think on the federal level, when we were looking at stakeholder engagement in terms of the adoption of an ESSA plan, I think Washington State did about as good a job as, I mean, there were some other states, but Washington did a terrific job. And I would be interested from your perspective on whether that work is going on still and how it's working.
So honestly, I don't know how that is trickling, how that work is trickling down to the practitioners on the ground, and I probably should, but it's really not the top of my list of things, and so how we develop those champions is we show the success that these programs can generate for our kids. And in the Rural Alliance, we're seeing this hunger, we're seeing this real desire to embed social emotional learning, culturally responsive teaching, and create a paradigm shift that just creates a culture of kindness. It has to be supported, though, with all of the other things that you're dealing with on a daily basis. You know, I'm a pretty good superintendent. I've been doing it a long time. And I'm really good at finding out what's important, but in my district, I still mop the floor. If a gate needs to be opened because somebody forgot their keys, I still go open those gates. If a kid needs to be taken home or there's a bus issue, I take that student home. And until we provide the resources in these communities that we can focus on that work, we're going to have barriers to really seeing that the development of those champions. We have to have people dedicated to that work in districts.
Actually, that was my answer. I don't mean this to be self-serving, but I only know my own experience. But my experience has been every district that I work in, when you can tell me who in the district is responsible for the work, then it has a much better chance of being alive, right? So I know that even though my title now is Director of Student Support, that I was hired to bring social emotional learning in. So there's a placeholder for it, and I can use that to create space for it. And then in the other district, I was clearly the social emotional learning coordinator because that was my title. So, but I think it's harder to do if there's not one place that's responsible for it that you can start talking to, and they can be the people that talk at the state level. And then I think that part of my job is to get what we're doing out there and make sure that people know that we're doing it. And so that's why I love like the Collaborating Districts Initiative and CASEL's work, and when Nick shows up and things, because then people at the local level go, oh my gosh, somebody's seeing us, and they get excited about that. And then again, it's harder for it to go away when somebody's written about you in an article or something like that. So I just always try to make sure they see when we hit good news. I also, then that's where my other piece of the caution comes from. Maybe this is just because we're Alaskan and we were the last frontier, and now you, in your rural worlds, there's a part of us that want to be pioneers. So we don't necessarily want it spoon-fed to us because there's a human pioneerish spirit to it. So don't do it all for us and then ask us to do it, because we would rather have this part of it where we're digging in and we're seeing it and we're like, oh, that is so cool, and then somebody celebrates what we did.
I would say that we tell policymakers all the time that it's critically important that they reach out and involve stakeholders. If that's not happening at your state, my advice is it is not the prom. You do not have to wait to be asked. You know, you can go and share what you've learned with policymakers, with your state elected officials, with your state legislator, with your state board of education member. I think it's critically important that if that conversation is not happening, to remember that it can start on either end. Yes, right here. Yeah, I think we're because we're live casting.
Yeah, I just was wondering, we had with the ESSA planning process, the stakeholder engagement in the communities, there was this big push for getting more social and emotional learning into the schools. It basically was a family's, parents' mandate to the schools. I was just wondering how you bring families into the discussion about social and emotional learning in your districts, and how is it going to be playing out at the schools? Where would you find ways and how you've made improvements with respect to that?
You have to have food, and you have to have some reason for families to come. And even at that, it's difficult. So we present at our school boards. We do presentations. I have 2 school boards, and I have 2 school board meetings a month. And we have it on the agenda to talk about social emotional learning. We have community gatherings where we talk about what social emotional learning, what the newest trends are. Those are very poorly attended. It's very difficult to get folks there. What we've started to do is we've started to try and tie things into other events. So if we have a volleyball game, we'll have a community meeting. If we have a football game, we'll have a community meeting. If we have an open house, we'll have a community meeting. And we serve food.
Trying to reach families has always been a challenge in education. One of the things that we have found successful is when social and personal competencies are part of a director of schools, which we call those superintendents in Tennessee. It's part of their strategic plan. We have several districts, one in particular who's presenting with me next week at our LEAD educational conference. Their director has done just that. They're on their 2nd full year of making that part of his strategic plan, and that means drilling that down to your parent and family engagement activities. So again, everything starts from the top down, and it really is all about leadership. And I can't stress that enough.
Trying to work my way here.
Put on my glasses, it's much better. There we go. Christy McGill from the Nevada Department of Education. And Vicki, if you ever want to dry out, Nevada is still always welcoming you. Nevada, we are in the laundry basket phase, where we have social emotional learning, PBIS, MTSS, trauma-informed care, restorative practices. And our districts have been asking us, help us bring coherence, or, how does this all work together? And we have like a good gut feeling that these mutually reinforce each other. But we find that the feeling of being overwhelmed is this laundry basket approach, right? So do you guys have any very intentional practices or approaches that we could kind of help with our districts about how to actually do this?
And I'm going to ask the panel and also And also maybe ask Nick to weigh in on this one as well.
So I have to start then. All right. Hi. So I think one of the places that I've seen kind of how to do this is really thinking about what are the goals that you're having for your kids. And I think this is one of the really good reasons about where you're providing guidance, as Vicki mentioned, but allowing people to wrestle with the work, is you're providing enough where folks need to really understand what are their ultimate goals of education. And I think that's one of the reasons also why even with the development of standards or indicators, you still want to have a discussion about what they are, is because even though there are a lot of terms where people might define them, we define them differently. I mean, just if you look at, so AR did a scan with RWJF about the number of terms just in social and emotional development. There's like over 800 unique terms and like 50 frameworks that we found. And so what you really want to know is how are we defining this? What are the goals of education? And then what are the practices then are going to support those goals? And where are the gaps in the practices that might not actually hit some of those goals? So I think it really needs to start with understanding what are the needs of the school and understanding the goals of the specific interventions and programs, because there is a lot of overlap. And so if you say, oh, RP is hitting our goal on social awareness and self-management, then okay, then we need maybe an SEL program that targets responsible decision-making and self-management or something, right? And so you kind of want to kind of think about the goals and I think what strategies are supporting those goals.
Well, you're struggling with what we're struggling with, is how to make coherence with that, because in my mind, I'll be honest, I see where they all fit together. But getting my mind out to the districts is very complicated. And one of the things that we are really focusing on at the state level is a comprehensive needs assessment. Really, schools don't do a comprehensive needs assessment on all these multi-tiered system support stuff they got going on. So they really, a lot of times, don't know what they're doing. And, and so we have different silos. And again, my big goal is to break down these silos within our school districts, within our schools, within our state government, so that we can all be working together. But that issue is one that we will be definitely addressing, especially if we get the new school climate transformation grant money, which we should know today, I hope. So if we do that, that's the goal of the grant, is to make it all fit together. So.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, and then Wisconsin,
I would just add on that one of the things schools and districts might need some guidance on is how to strategically abandon things that aren't working. So when we're doing a lot of mapping about what's going on and districts are seeing all these different things that they're doing, we kind of hold on to them, and when they're not being done or being done well or even evaluated, we still hold on to them. So by strategically abandoning some things, we open up space for others.
Yep. Yes, John.
So the other thing, I've worked in larger school districts where we've implemented some similar programming, and the great benefit I have right now is I can literally touch everybody in my district. So I can work with food service, I can work with bus drivers, I can work with paraeducators. In the larger system, we forgot that piece. And so we focused on teachers. And I don't know that it matters exactly how you do it or what you do, as long as you involve everybody in the educational system. If that child gets off the bus in the morning and then the lunch line, the child is treated poorly and then goes to the classroom, it doesn't matter what you've got, because they've already, they're already at the point where they're not going to, they flip their lid and they're not ready to learn. And so I think it's essential that whatever you do includes the entire learning environment.
Is this on? Hi, I'm Melissa Schlinger from CASEL, and Linda asked me to please just make a couple comments specifically about your question, and I'll be speaking a little bit later about this, but CASEL has been grappling with those questions now for quite some time, and since 2011, when we launched the Collaborating Districts Initiative, was specifically designed to answer that question. How do you do systemic SEL in large urban districts, but frankly, any district. Fast forward to today, we started with 8 districts. We now have 21 partners in this process, and we've been documenting what we've learned along the way. Those first 8 districts, really, we struggled with them together to learn how to do this work. And the districts that have come since them have done this much more efficiently because they've been able to still be pioneers, which I appreciate what you said. You still have to discover this for yourself, but stand on the shoulders of some who have made mistakes before them. On CASEL's website is, somebody mentioned this, the SEL District Resource Center. It's a library of everything we learned along that way, and it's free. So it has what did we learn, and it's broken into 10 areas. What is who should be involved in this particular stage? What do they do? When should they do it? And then guidance on how they should do it. And then there's actually a library of artifacts from other districts. So if we're going to recommend you really need a communications plan, here's how you do a communications plan, who should be part of that, when should you do it, and then here's examples from districts of communications plans and communications artifacts. So here's our newsletter for parents. Here's our social media strategy. This is what our Facebook page looks like. So it's free. It's I think it's casel.drc.org, but you can get to it from CASEL's website. And it's a really good place to start and really see what have others done and how can I learn from them. Also, what Beth mentioned, in January we will be releasing guidance for schools that we are piloting in some places very intentionally with coaching, in some places more secretly. But that will be available to everybody in January.
Great. Other questions? Don, I was not ignoring you. I was just working my way around.
Thank you very much, Chris. I work for a coalition at the national level called the Campaign for High School Equity. And we're a coalition of civil rights organizations trying to bring the civil rights voice into federal education policy. I'm mentioning that because our big challenge was how to create collaboration across all the key players at the national level, NASB, CCSSO, NGA, others, but also how to create coherence down to the grassroots. So all of these coalitions, of course, have their state and local affiliates. What I've learned, and I'm sure all of you know, is that that idea of vertical and horizontal collaboration and coherence is one of profound challenge. And what you find is the more you include, the more you have to be open to the incredible messiness of more and more voices. And so I would just like to pose that what we can learn as a perhaps theory of change or a new mindset in terms of stakeholder engagement, because my work at NASB with Chris, we really have gone a long way in the importance of stakeholder engagement, is to think of it as not just, yes, of course we need to include other stakeholders in our existing kinds of processes, our existing approach to change, but that it's a completely different understanding of change. That change is messy. The more you engage stakeholders, it's going to be longer, and we have to get out of our short-term mindset, what Deming's derailed as management by objective, by metric, and recognize that change is a long-term process. We need to try to manage and cultivate those kinds of expectations because there is this incredible urgency and hunger and need in so many schools. How do you do that and yet also let them know we're doing it, we're making change, but it's a long-term process? So I guess the idea would be in terms of mindsets that leaders, especially those coming onto the board, to develop their capacity, they need to have a greater sense of humility and patience and recognize that stakeholder engagement is not just listening tours, but it's really trying to empower those at the local level.
I remember a conversation with Tony Smith in Illinois who says he is most grateful for the messiness and the time that the board and he took to, as he said, be messy for a while as they were trying to listen to communities and trying to hear in a very, very diverse state, let's face it. So I think I appreciate that. We've probably got time for one more good question, and then I'm going to just give the panel here a little advance warning that we're going to each take a couple of minutes to wrap. If there was only one thing they could leave with you and leave in your head, what would that be? But we do have time probably for one more question if anybody has one. Surely. Yes, right over here. Great.
I wanted to ask about your experience with assessment and that box of continuous improvement for your work.
So, are you talking about integrating academic assessment into this, or SEL assessment? So we don't have a formal SEL assessment tool, but because we are trying to use SEL to create habits of effectiveness within our academic structure, what we're seeing is that we're seeing our students, we believe we're seeing, it's early, but we believe we're seeing our students become more independent learners and develop better habits around their academics. And we believe that's an indicator that we're seeing social emotional growth. We're not evaluating or assessing social emotional growth other than it feels better. Our data shows that we're having fewer discipline problems. Is that a social emotional aspect or not? I'm not going to make that leap, but our culture is improving.
The only really intentional from the district level going out to our schools social emotional assessment is our school climate social emotional learning survey. And our survey has, we lifted the Washoe County's social emotional learning construct and put it into ours, and with their permission. But and we are using that to see if we're not assessing kids at the kid level, we're assessing our work and our implementation at the school level.
So yeah, I think assessment is like a huge conversation, and I think it goes back to the conversation that started in the earlier panels. It's assessment for what? Like, why are we actually trying to assess, and what are we going to use that assessment data for? And I know there's a lot of really innovative work right now around SEL assessment to try and think about like broader scales. I know that CASEL has an assessment working group right now to really think through what does assessment mean and look like. AIR has a suite of tools called Ready to Assess to kind of go through a process around to select an assessment. And I think one of the things that the conversation needs to move a little bit more, I think Beth hit it, is the formative assessment, implementation assessment. How are we measuring fidelity? And how do we coach with that data? And so really trying to focus on the practice side of things, I think, is incredibly important. And then I also think one of the things that we need to think a little bit more about is in all these working groups that I hear when stakeholders come together and talk about the development of developmental benchmarks or whatnot, is how are we going to assess these very specific indicators, right, that are more granular than what current assessment that I think currently is. And so I also think we need to think about what are performance-based assessments that are already occurring in the classroom, and how can we embed social emotional competencies within those types of formative assessments that are occurring as well, I think is one of the conversation pieces that I see moving forward.
I just want to echo and approve what you just said, because that is really the only way that is going to happen. If it can be embedded in benchmark testing that teachers are already required to do.
Now, we are aware that we are the last thing standing between you and lunch, but I was going to give everybody an opportunity in about a minute, which is about what we have. If you could leave this group with just one thought of going back to our very beginning construct, which is there are models, there are some successful models, that there are things you can do. What would it be? And I'll let you decide in which order you want to go, or I will.
I'm number one here. One of the takeaways that I tell our districts in the state is around our messaging. Social and personal competencies, all our work with MTSS, trauma, it's all about messaging. And the message that we give them is one I think the gentleman over there brought out. Change does not happen overnight. In education, we are notorious for, if it doesn't work the first year, let's throw it out and start something else. When we're doing our work in the districts, our message is it takes 3 to 5 years to see any measurable change in academics, discipline, attendance, all those metrics that we're so hung up on measuring. So again, that has to be the message that we give teachers, but you're so right, it's not just teachers, it's support staff, and it's the community, and it's parents. It takes time.
If I knew what I was going to say, I guess my framework has always been around, I clean up a lot of these jumbled schoolhouse type things that you're talking about because I believe in the adoption of social emotional learning standards, and so I'm really fond of the standards, and then I can use those so that if a school wants to do trauma informed, well, that fits into the standards. If a school wants to do restorative, well, that fits into the standards. And so I think that we can take care of a lot of the conversation if we choose a framework and we don't legislate the rest, I guess.
So, first of all, Ferry County is absolutely gorgeous, and as the former president of the Chamber of Commerce, I would invite all of you to visit. You can get there from here. Best time of year is summer, which starts in July. I truly am humbled to be here. The work that's being done around this issue may be the most important work that's being done in my 30-plus year career. And I would encourage everybody here to continue that work, regardless of whether districts such as mine can continue to implement this work, or whether this work can be sustainable. It's going to, whether it goes and fits and starts, it has to continue. And so I guess the only thing I can leave you with is please keep up the good fight. This is amazing stuff. Thank you.
Thanks. And Nick, if you want it, you can have the last word.
Oh, I always liked having the last word. So I think we're at a really exciting time in social emotional learning. I think we've learned a lot through the CDI. I think we've learned a lot through the CSI, and I'm really excited to see how we start blending the learning between both of these initiatives and efforts that folks have been really doing for a really long time to really support the youth in this country. So I'm really excited to be a part of this journey with you all. So thanks.
Thanks very much. And will you join me in thanking this terrific panel? All right. Linda, do we have any housekeeping or information or anybody?
But I just wanted to say I've been getting text messages from some of our state teams that are online, and I just wanted to welcome them as well and let you all know that you're joined by a broader audience of state teams. I also wanted to make sure that you all knew, as you're talking about district-state partnerships and collaborations, there are also people in this room who are thinking deeply about that. Heather Hirsch and Craig from Minnesota, and Lawanda in Delaware, and Ruth Cross in Illinois, and Christy McGill in Nevada. You guys are all, and I've probably left people out, and I'll name you after lunch when I realize that I didn't see you in the room, but I just wanted you all to know that there are others in the room who are also amazing champions for this work, and I wanted to make sure as you were having conversations at lunch that you knew that you could follow up with them as well. Oh, can I say one more thing? Real quick. The links, several of you have mentioned resources, guidance, standards. The links are in the USB documents that you have. Page 5 of the Emerging Findings report, as well as a little handout that we put there. There are links to all of these wonderful state resources.
Excellent morning. It's time for lunch and people's discussions at their tables, and we'll start again at 1 o'clock. So